Good evening. My name is Lori Shearer, and I'm the chair of the Holocaust Task Force at Beth Israel. I am grateful to be in community with you this evening to commemorate Yom Hashoah. Well before the October 7th and the riots on college campuses, our Jewish community had observed a steady and concerning rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence right here in San Diego and across the country. Rabbi Navarez saw a need to have a task force at Beth Israel dedicated to bearing witness to the Holocaust and reimagining our Yom Hashoah commemorations. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Dr. Leo Roose and his wife of 64 years, soon to be 65 years, Sonia. They are here with us this evening. 2 years ago, we had the honor and the privilege of dedicating our Czech Holocaust Torah scroll. The task force will continue to educate our community and congregation about Beth Israel's obligations as custodians of this special Torah, described as a silent survivor of the Shoah. The Holocaust Task Force is also focused on equipping Jewish youth and adults with resources and education to discuss the Holocaust and prepare them for what they might face in their schools and community, such as Holocaust denial. Statistics reveal that only half of Americans 18 to 29 believe the Holocaust really happened, and only a third of young people know what Auschwitz is. Our task force will remain hopeful and steadfast in our work to advocate, educate, and bear witness. Thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you, Lori, for all of your tireless work to making this happen. And I'm so incredibly moved to see you and those who are joining us online virtually with us as we gather for this solemn Yom HaShoah commemoration. And just to note, we have a number of individuals from our congregation and from the greater San Diego Jewish community who are currently on the March to the Living. Tomorrow they make their several kilometer trek to Auschwitz. And so they do that knowing that this evening we are in commemoration, hearing stories and narratives, singing, listening, and learning, and we honor their work and their sacred bearing witness as well. Each year we are compelled to pause, to reflect deeply on the unfathomable horrors of the Holocaust, and to recommit ourselves to memory, to justice, and to resilience. We remember the 6 million Jewish souls, the 5 million other individuals from marginalized groups as well, who were mercilessly taken from us. Remember the families shattered, the communities that were erased. And we honor the survivors, those who endured the unimaginable and yet somehow found the strength to rebuild, to tell their stories, and to live with purpose. This year, our remembrance takes on new layers of pain and urgency. In the aftermath of October 7th massacres and amidst the still inconceivable reality that hostages remain in captivity in Gaza, we are reminded that anti-Semitism and cruelty are not relics of the past. The world continues to be complex, fractured, and at times terrifying. That is why our act of remembrance today is not only about the past, it is a moral obligation to remain vigilant in the present. As we listen to the sacred personal story of our congregant and survivor, Dr. Leo Roose, we do so knowing that his testimony is both a light in the darkness and a warning flare, that hatred left unchecked can destroy, and that the will to survive can uplift generations. Let us hold the duality as we move through this commemoration. Let us honor those who perish by lifting up the voices of those who live to tell it. Let us pledge again and again that we will never forget and that we will never be silent in the face of hatred wherever it may arise.
An excerpt from President Obama's 2012 remarks at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We must tell our children, but more than that, we must teach them, because remembrance without resolve is a hollow gesture. Awareness without action means nothing. In this sense, never again is a challenge to us all, to pause and to look within. For the Holocaust may have reached its barbaric climax at Treblinka, at Auschwitz, and Belzec, but it started in the hearts of ordinary men and women. And we have seen it again, madness that can sweep through people, sweep through nations, embed itself. The killings in Cambodia, the killings in Rwanda, the killings in Bosnia, the killings in Darfur, and I would personally add the killings on October 7th, they shock our conscience. But they are the awful extreme of a spectrum of ignorance and intolerance that we see every day. The bigotry that says another person is less than my equal, less than human. These are the seeds of hate that we cannot let take root in our heart. Never again is a challenge to reject hatred of all four types, including anti-Semitism, which has no place in a civilized world.
I now invite members of the Holocaust Task Force, as well as Dr. Leo Roose and his wife Sonia, to light 6 candles, each candle with meaning, and they will light them in memory tonight. I invite Matt Valji, John Lefter, Lori Shear, Dr. Leo Roose and Sonia, and Leo Siklik to light these 6 candles.
sacred memory of the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. Men, women, and 1.5 million children, each with a name, each with a life. We remember them not as a number, but as a people whose light was cruelly extinguished.
This candle for the survivors, those who endured the unendurable and emerged with a fierce commitment to life. Their testimony has become our inheritance, their resilience our moral compass.
We light this candle for the righteous among the nations, those who at great personal risk reached out a hand in defiance of evil. Their courage reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there is always a choice.
We light this candle, poets and the prophets, the dreamers and the dancers, the rabbis, the teachers, and the children, whose voices were silent, whose futures were stolen, carry their dream forward.
Light this candle as a vow that we will remember, that we will teach and testify and tell the stories, so that memory becomes resistance against forgetting, and history becomes a shield against its repetition.
We light this candle for the generations yet to come. May we inherit a world more just, more compassionate, more humane. A world shaped by memory, lit by the flame of never again.
All the guards with the dogs that used to stand in every corner had disappeared. It was all gone, as though it had never been. It was one of the miracles. The Russians entered and were in such a condition that no one moved. No one went out. We did not laugh. We were not happy. We were apathetic. And the Russians came. A general came in. He was Jewish. He told us that he was delighted, as this was the first camp in which he had found people alive. He started to cry, but we didn't. He wept, and we didn't.
June 22nd, 1941. That was the day the world shattered. My name is Mozilla Schlein. I was at the Gernstein's house when they came. I remember the pounding of the boots, the loud voices, the screams. I heard them take my mother, my father, little Bashiele. I crawled into the attic, pressing myself into the shadows, holding my breath. I heard the shots downstairs, heard the silence that followed. I should have died that day, but I didn't. That night, I slipped into the forest, my violin the only thing I carried. I was 12, alone, hiding, surviving somehow. Others were there too, Jews who refused to die quietly. That's how I found Uncle Misha. He asked me to help, to walk, to listen, to fight. I stood in the town square of Overbrook, my violin tucked under my chin, my fingers dancing over the strings. I played for the Nazis who stopped to listen. One of them took me to a restaurant where I played for them night after night. They never suspected me. A child, a musician, but I was more than that. I was a weapon. Day after day, I smuggled dynamite inside my violin case. 1 trip, 2 trips, 6, 18 kilos of explosives hidden where their drunken eyes would never look. I played for them, and I waited. Then I came. 200 Nazis gathered in the restaurant. I lit the fuse in the dark, my hand steady. Walked up the stairs, looked a soldier in the eye, raised my hand and said, "Heil Hitler." I was far away when the explosion came. I raised my fist and whispered, "For my parents, for Bathsheba."
Good evening and welcome. My name is Ronnie Yudoff, and I serve on the Holocaust Task Force under the able leadership of Lori Shearer, and I'm here to tell you about a survivor among us, one that lives right here at Beth Israel. Not a person like our distinguished guest, Dr. Roose, from whom you'll hear shortly, but rather our Czech Torah scroll, written in the 1880s and still in use here today. Scroll 1260 is labeled as coming from the South Bohemia communities of Pizik and Strakonic, which are actually two separate cities about 10 miles apart, about 50 miles south of Prague. Jewish life in the regions of Bohemia and Moravia, today the Czech Republic, existed for more than 1,000 years before World War II. Over that time, a rich Jewish culture developed, centered in Prague, and spread across hundreds of communities throughout that region. When Nazis decided to liquidate communal and private property in 1942, Dr. Karol Stein in Prague received permission from the Nazis to write to all outlying Jewish communities in Bohemia and Moravia, instructing them to send the contents of their synagogues to the Jewish Museum in Prague for safekeeping during the war. Thus, over 1,800 Torah scrolls, plus gold and silver items and ritual textiles were sent, along with thousands of books, and among them was our Torah from Pizik and Strakonic. Under Nazi supervision, under near impossible conditions of war, Jewish museum curators inventoried and meticulously cataloged everything for 2 years. They needed more than 40 warehouses, many of them now deserted Prague synagogues, to store these treasures. And when the task was at last completed, the curators who had been put to this work were deported to Terezin concentration camps in late 1944 and then to Auschwitz. There was only one survivor. The scrolls were discovered in the early 1960s by the communist government that then ruled Czechoslovakia. Ralph Yablon, a well-known Jewish philanthropist in London with great interest in Jewish art and culture, consulted with his rabbi, Harold Reinhardt, at the Westminster Synagogue, and on his advice, Yablon became the benefactor who put up the money to buy the scrolls. On February 7th, 1964, 2 trucks laden with 1,564 scrolls arrived at the Westminster Synagogue. The Museum of the Czech Torah Scrolls is housed there today at the Westminster Synagogue in Knightsbridge, just around the corner from Harrods. The Memorial Scrolls Trust, a nonprofit separate from the Westminster Synagogue, was then established to carry out the task of distributing the Czech Torah Scrolls to living Jewish congregations around the world. From the depths of destruction to a new life in service, about 1,400 of the original 1,564 scrolls are on loan to congregations, museums, schools, and institutions. Scrolls are never sold or donated, but rather loaned for as long as the community can maintain, honor, and use it. A few years ago, when my husband and I moved to San Diego and joined the synagogue, I inquired, and Rabbi Cantor Bernstein explained to me that we did not have a Torah scroll from the Memorial Scrolls Trust in London. I approached Rabbi Navarez, who made application for a Torah from the Memorial Scrolls Trust, and we acquired scroll number 1260 in 2023. Last year at this service, you heard from Susan Hutchinson, who described how she lovingly made our scroll's blue mantle using symbols, colors, and materials significant to our history and our people. It is really gorgeous, exquisitely handcrafted by Susan and befitting our Torah's long journey. I think you'll agree that this treasure, stored so long ago for safekeeping during wartime, has found its home with us. And please, after our service, feel free to come up and look at Susan's exquisite handwork that she did. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. We are deeply grateful for your knowledge and dedication to learning about our Czech Torah scroll. Next, we're going to hear from a young congregant whose family has been members of our synagogue for generations. Kate Chasen's grandfather, Cy Coleman, is a past president. Her mother, Dr. Stacy Coleman, grew up here, and her father, Mike Chasen, currently serves on our board. We are delighted to hear from Kate from Prague.
Like the committee mentioned, my name is Kate Chasen, and I'm a junior studying abroad here in Prague to learn a little bit more about European Jewish history. And the committee in particular wanted me to talk about how our Torah scroll fits into Czech history more broadly. So starting in about the 11th century, Jews moved here on Arab caravans into small insular ghettos. These were communities that were exclusively Jewish and were governed by Jewish ritual practice, not by the monarchical law of the land at the time. Now this is likely where our Torah scroll would fit in. Between the 11th and the 15th centuries, Jews lived by the text and lived by halakha, not by any sort of legal framework around them, because oftentimes they were legally persecuted. But that changed in the 15th and 16th centuries with the Jewish Enlightenment and the Emancipation period broadly. Those legal persecutions were lifted, and Jews assimilated into European society broadly, especially here in the Czech Republic, where Czech Jews were not just recognized, but they were hailed as heroes. You have Czech icons like Gustav Mahler and Franz Kafka, recognized not just as Czech icons, but as Czech Jewish icons. And that momentum continued all the way up until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where we saw rising anti-Semitism in Europe. And even though we saw some of that in the Czech Republic, the first president of the Czechoslovakian Republic, Thomas Masaryk, actually advocated against anti-Semitism here, which was incredibly powerful. And even though we saw reformers that continued in the 20th century, where 20 to 25% of this city's population is eradicated, we still see it preserved here today. And it's unfortunately not for a positive and positive reason. Hitler advocated that Prague and the Czech Republic be preserved as a museum to the extinct race, the eradication of Jews. But because he failed, we now see monuments like the Jerusalem Synagogue as a positive. We now see ritualistic preservations like our Torah scroll as a positive, because they are not a symbol of his success. It is a symbol of our survival.
Psalm 23, said by Gerald Cohen. Adonai is my shepherd, I lack nothing.
When I was 13, I became a Bar Mitzvah.
When he was 13, he became a Bar Mitzvah.
When I was 13, my teachers taught me to put tefillin on my arm.
When he was 13, his teachers taught him to throw a hand grenade with his arm.
When I was 13, I studied the pathways of the Bible and the roadways of the Talmud.
When he was 13, he studied the canals of Warsaw and the sewers of the ghetto.
At my Bar Mitzvah, I took an oath to live as a Jew.
At his Bar Mitzvah, he took an oath to die as a Jew.
At my Bar Mitzvah, I blessed God.
At his Bar Mitzvah, he questioned God.
At my Bar Mitzvah, I lifted my voice and sang.
At his Bar Mitzvah, he lifted his fists and fought.
At my Bar Mitzvah, I read from the scroll of the Torah.
At his Bar Mitzvah, he wrote a scroll of fire.
At my Bar Mitzvah, I wore a new tallit over a new suit.
At his Bar Mitzvah, he wore a rifle and bullets over a suit of rags.
At my Bar Mitzvah, I started my road of life.
At his Bar Mitzvah, he began his road to martyrdom.
At my Bar Mitzvah, family and friends came to say l'chaim.
At his Bar Mitzvah, Rabbi Akiba and Trumpuldor, Hannah and her 7 sons came to escort him to heaven.
At my Bar Mitzvah, they praised my voice, my song, my melody.
At his Bar Mitzvah, they praised his strength, his courage, and fearlessness.
When I was 13, I was called up to the Torah. I went to the Bima.
When he was 13, his body went up in smoke. His soul rose to God.
When I was 13, I became a Bar Mitzvah and lived.
When he was 13, he became a Bar Mitzvah and lives now within each of us.
It is my great honor and privilege to introduce our congregant, Dr. Roose, a hidden child and survivor of the Holocaust, whose life story is a powerful testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Born in Amsterdam in 1937, Dr. Roose survived the horrors of Nazi-occupied Europe through extraordinary luck and the bravery of righteous Gentiles. Twice arrested by the SS and twice miraculously escaped, once with the help of 2 German soldiers, whose survival is all the more remarkable when we remember that 75% of Dutch Jews perished. His father, a heroic member of the resistance, was executed in 1944 for forging identity and ration cards to save others. After the war, Leo immigrated to the United States in 1950, beginning a new chapter that would include an impressive academic and professional journey in chemistry, a decades-long career at the forefront of the electronics revolution, and a beautiful family life with his wife Sonia, whom he met fittingly in a German class. Dr. Roose's story spans centuries of Jewish history, from Sephardic roots in the 16th century Holland to survival in World War II, to pioneering science and raising a family deeply committed to service, education, and healing. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roose.
Could I have slide number 1, please? This is actually the 3rd time I'm speaking in San Diego. The previous 2 times were at the Balboa Naval Hospital during Yom Hashoah, which most people don't realize, but the Navy has every year a Remembrance in Yom Hashoah. And it was quite interesting to see that many naval personnel listening and standing in attention for about an hour. I'm trying not to talk that long today. I put up a photograph of, on the left side, it's my father's family. That's a total mix of Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. We have a Cardozo in there, a Sephardi, and so you know what part of the Jewish congregation that belongs to. And then the rest are Ashkenazis. Our family goes back in Holland to the early 1600s, and the Dutch governments have kept very good records, and I can go back to my family tree almost to the time of the Inquisition, when they immigrated, both from Portugal and Spain. On the right hand of I just skipped something here, but of that family that you see there, as you know, there's only one child. That was my cousin Beppie, who died in concentration camp at the age of 14. The next youngest person there is my father's youngest sister, who is the only one of the family who managed to leave Holland and through Cuba, married her fiance who was living in New York. And that's how, and she immigrated to the United States because he had a green card. That's how it worked. That's the reason we came to the United States. That was the one surviving member of the family. Of those that you see there, only my mother, who's sitting, and you can see the red circle around her, she's the only one who survived of my side of the family. Two sisters survived, and that was, but it's not on the picture, all the children that were there. I was the second oldest. There were 22 or 23, we're never sure, because some were born while in hiding and captured by the Germans. None of them survived. So that's that side of the family. And this picture was taken on my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary, according to my mother. I wasn't there, so I can't tell. On the right-hand side is my mother's side of the family, and that's purely Sephardic. My grandparents are on the far right, and my mother and father are standing up. My mother's youngest sister is sitting down on the far left, and then my uncle and my other aunt. The other people are there, no idea who they are, but that was the family, my mother's side. Only my mother survived out of that. In that part of the side of the family, I had 3 cousins that survived and myself. There were no other children of that close relationship. Could I have the next slide, please? Yep. The Dutch were mostly sent to Sobibor. That's a concentration camp most people never heard of. It exists in Poland. And the only ones who really knew about it were Russian Jews and Russian captured soldiers and Dutch Jews. Why Sobibor? Nobody knows. What we do know is that the Germans tried to eradicate that camp before the ending of the war, and it was resurrected by a family of American Jews who paid the money to have it dug up, and they have now finally turned it into a cemetery for Jews that perished there. Now, as you heard, my father was a resistance fighter. He had the ability, strange as it may be, he was able to forge documents and make printing plates out of that. And this is a very necessary item for the resistance.
So we can see here.
Okay, sorry, keep walking around. If you were hiding, every family was handed so many ration cards for every member of the family. So if you were hiding Jews, you needed additional ration cards, and you could not get that, obviously, from the officials. So what was done at that time, my father made the printing plates, and they forged the ration cards, and at the end we'll show you a copy of it, ration cards, and that saved many Jews because they were able to get the food that was necessary, and food was strictly rations, especially towards the end of the war. Let's see, the next one, the fact that my father was in the resistance also made my survival possible, if the best word for it. If we can have the next slide, please. when the war broke out, we were just going around, and you can see it over here, it's hard to see, but these are various stops that we made during the war, and starting really at the outbreak of the war, where we were living in a small town called Bussen. We then moved back, as we go to the top, from left to right. We then moved to the Waverstaat in Amsterdam, and this is when the war broke out. Now, my father was a draftee, and he fought on May 5th. When the Germans invaded, he was called to the front, and as history shows, the entire fight lasted 5 days before it ended. The next slide is a place where go back one, please. The third place is a city or a town in Holland called Heemstede. This was a children's home, and my parents, when they went into hiding, placed me and my cousin there, hoping that we would survive the war, not knowing what was going to happen, but so many German Jews had immigrated to Holland during the time that brought back the horrors from what was occurring in Germany. So they had a great deal of mistrust of what was going to happen. So I was placed in the children's home where my parents were hidden. I'll leave it off for a minute. From there, from Heemstede, and this is where things get pretty hairy, and I did not remember much of it, but recently, when we were moving, I found a great deal of papers from my mother, and I got a lot of information from that. And at the same time, a documentary was made called The Angels of Amsterdam, to say it correctly. What happened, all the Dutch, when I was in Heemstede, a town, we were raided by the SS, and there was no reason for the SS to raid a children's home. That didn't make any sense, except they were notified there were Jewish kids hiding in the children's home. And the way they separated us was very simple. They asked all the boys to drop their pants and see if they were circumcised. In Holland, that was a rarity for Gentiles to be circumcised, but definitely for the Jews, very, very common. From that town, and that's the only thing I remember of that, was the journey going back to Amsterdam from that place, which was in the middle of the night or evening. It was dark. And I still cannot listen to, if you go to Europe, the sirens that the police use or the ambulances use are very different from what we hear in the United States. When I go back to Europe and I hear that sound, that's what the Staatsenwaffen they used to get us to make way for themselves. That's how I was transported. I was placed in it's now a museum that was called the Schouwburg, that means nothing else but a theater, which was converted for a place to place the children. And that was the first place where they collected all Jewish kids that live in Amsterdam, from babies on to teenagers and older. And from there, they were going to be transported to either Vught, which was one concentration camp in Holland, or to Westerbork. These were just camps, holding pens, if you want to call them that. From there, they went to concentration camp. Here is where things really changed. When the children were collected in the Schouwburg, the staff were Gentiles in most cases. There were some Jewish after the war, we found out, but not many. Through that entire system, about 15,000 Jewish kids moved through. That was about roughly the population of Jewish children in Holland. They went through that particular building. Of those, 650 were actually helped to escape by the staff that was working there. I was one of those, and that's a rarity. Of those 650, less than half survived the war anyway, but at least that many survived. I do not remember much about the place. I remember crying at night because the lights were on and children around us were crying. It was just a mess, as you can imagine. How old was I? 4 years old. Memories aren't that great at that point. You just accept what you see and you can't do much about it. But because when I do remember that night when they took us, and they took small groups of children, and behind the building was a school, and the school was involved in the escape of the children, and that they had left the doors open on the backside of the building, so they could move the kids into that building, into the school, and then the Dutch resistance came and picked up the children as they came through. They were distributed all over Holland at that point. I was lucky because my father was in the resistance, and the Dutch underground knew where he was, and I was reunited with my parents at that point. And this, for the sign, the photo that says Amsterdam, there's a section in Amsterdam that would be called, in the early years of the east side of New York, this was the toughest section of Amsterdam. And German soldiers really did not really dare to go into that section of town until very early on. There was a uprising by labor unions when they started deporting the Jews to Germany. They took a group of men by the canals and they picked every 10th man and shot them. At that point, the resistance sort of dropped off. At any rate, we stayed there until I got pretty sick and they had to call a doctor. And since my father was still doing the engraving, the Dutch resistance kept up with him, and I remember people calling on him and picking up paperwork, whatever else was necessary. But anyway, once a doctor had arrived and they got the necessary medication, they had to move us. They did not trust the doctor not to tell the Germans. And so we moved onward to the next section in Holland. And this is where things really became difficult. Not so, if you think about it, I was four years old, 3.5, 4. There were people, and there were a lot of collaborators in Holland. Not all the Dutch were all that nice. So at any rate, we were placed in a house, an average apartment building in Holland is 3 stories. We were in the middle floor, and above us they were safe, but below us were collaborators with the Germans. Now, one of the safest places, obviously, is to be places where the Germans wouldn't necessarily look for you. What it meant, though, that the family we stayed there with had no children, and the woman below us stayed home all day when the husband worked, which meant that I could not. My parents had to control me not to talk loud, not to walk on the floor, because if they heard us and they knew that the neighbors upstairs above them were not home, who was in the house? We did this, and I don't know how my parents did it. How do you keep a 4-year-old quiet? Can't flush the toilet, can't run, can't yell, can't scream, can't do anything. And they did it. It's an amazing part of my mother and father at the time. I did learn things. I learned to read at that point, because what else could you do? And I learned the arithmetic tables all the way up to 40 or something like that. I can still recite them. But that situation became unsafe, and we moved to another part of Amsterdam. And on the average, we stayed in the places maybe 3 months at maximum, because at that point in time, the Germans were paying the Dutch $7.25 for each Jew that they brought to the Germans' attention. So the underground, or the resistance, as you want to call it, the problem with that is they dealt in cells, so nobody knew anything, everybody else. And our contact, and I remember the gentleman very well, he came on his bicycle, and one of the reasons he could do this
one leg was shorter than the other, and so he couldn't work for the Germans, and he was pretty safe to do. He was the contact for the rest of the underground. We moved, he came in at night, and he took me on his bicycle, and we drove to another part of Amsterdam. My mother and I went separately, and my father moved separately, and we were united again. And then in the northern part of Amsterdam, it calls Amsterdam Noord, and you had to get there taking a ferry and all that, which is very dangerous. We had ID cards, but I'm fairly dark-haired, and most Dutch tend to be blondish, if nothing else, except for the Spanish influence. But obviously we got through that. We moved along much further. We finally ended up in the central part of Holland, where in the town called Ede. Now the biggest factory in Ede was a rayon nylon factory, and it actually was owned by Jews, obviously not at that time. That was the most dangerous place we actually stayed, because the resistance didn't trust the people we were staying with. They were paying the owners that we were staying with, they were paying them money so that we could stay there, and they wanted more and more money. And the thought was that if they kept paying, eventually he would give us up to the Germans. And so we fled again, and we went to the town called Hilsum. Now, for those who not many know, but it's right next to Arnhem. And in 1944, for those who ever saw the movie A Bridge Too Far, or read Cornelius Ryan's book, A Bridge Too Far, well, we were there. And I can tell you that 5 days under the American-British armies, and the Germans came right back. But some things came out of that. The parachutists dropped their parachutes, and my mother made shirts for that for me. But one of the things is they were running gliders, and we were staying in a home. And when the DC-3s dropped the gliders off, they dropped the cables, and it went right through the roof of the house that we were staying in. It wasn't a big height, but it was enough to go right through the roof. Then we had to stay in the cellar for about a week, 10 days, till the battle was over. And when we came out, there was really nothing left of the house. But what the Germans had retaken the town, and they were evacuating all the inhabitants because they were going to make a garrison there, whatever they were going to do there. And that's when we were marched from in columns. We went from Hilsum back to the town of Ede, but right in the middle, the SS was directing that. Right in the middle there, myself, my parents were picked up by looking at us and asking for ID. And the ID cards that were made were okay at night, or somebody didn't look at them carefully. But if you looked at them carefully enough, you knew they were faked. And for the second time, I was captured by the SS. They brought us to a house and put us in a cellar and locked the door. And they had a drunken party that night. And this is where the situation is where there is no black and white. At some point at night, the door was opened, and 2 German soldiers. Now, they were young. They were obviously draftees, and this was 1944. The armies were coming up from France through Belgium into Holland already at that point. And they told us to run, which we obviously did. That was in danger of their own lives. And by the way, all these people that hit us, their lives were at stake. In many cases, they had children, and in many cases, when the Germans did catch someone hiding, Jews, they went to camp, and some were shot. So for those Gentiles, this was a very dangerous situation for them as well as for us. And they did it anyway, and that's courage. We went from the Dutch resistance have followed us, and I don't know how they did it, and some of those did survive, so to tell the tale how they knew where we were. And they brought us to a farm the next day. And I have no idea where we stayed overnight after we were let go. They brought us to a farm, and that day the farm was raided by the German army. And they weren't looking for Jews. At that point in the war, they really had no intentions of bringing any Jews out, because they had no way of transporting them to Germany anyway. But they came to look for able-bodied men to build fortifications. And they were particularly looking for all the teenagers and anybody in that age group and up. And unfortunately, they caught my father, and he had printing plates and a bunch of the forged documents with him. And he was executed the following day in Apeldoorn, in a town in Holland. He was not the only one. There were other resistance fighters, and so there was a big monument for him there, but it doesn't do anybody any good. As soon as that happened, my mother and I were redirected to a different town in Lunteren, which is a very small town. It's all farmland at that point. And we managed to survive there for the rest of the war. And that's how my story went. Now, after the war, now I was alone with my mother, and she was hoping that her family would be returning from concentration camps. So we went back to Amsterdam. And I remember going daily with my mother to the central part of Amsterdam, actually where the palace was on the Dam. And on a daily basis, we went to look there to see the Red Cross had put up charts of names, roll after roll of names of Jews that had perished, and of Dutch Jews that had perished, and those who had returned. And so my mother kept going back every day to look at the names, if her sisters or her brother-in-laws or her sister-in-laws would return, and none of them ever did. I don't understand how my mother managed to get through that. It's emotionally, still having to take care of me. And my cousin Lainey, who was also in the night I was caught by the SS. She looked like a typical Dutch girl, very blonde hair, very blue eyes. So you wouldn't know she was Jewish. And they did remove her after the raid by the SS, and she was placed in a family in Hilversum, which is a town in Holland. I don't know if any of you remember a book called Michel, which was about a hidden child who the family tried to get back. And this happened to my cousin. My mother and her mother were sisters, and the two fathers were brothers. So she was about as close as we could get. And this had to go to court before the family would give her up. And I still think it's the worst thing we ever did. Because emotionally, she was dragged from leaving her parents at the age of 2, now taken away from a family that she lived with for about 3 years, and getting to know as a family and somebody taking care of her mother. And all of a sudden, put back with 2 strangers, myself and of course my mother, who she doesn't remember. She was a baby. And the rest of her life was very difficult. She went from, the interesting part is she went from a very strict Protestant to a very observant Jew. Well, Hasidic Jew, really, so big change. And she married and had 3 children, and I don't know how many grandchildren at this point. I have lost count. Anyway, we went back to Amsterdam. I went to Rosh Hashanah, I started the 3rd grade in Rosh Hashanah. Now you have to imagine there were teenagers there who had never gone to school, and There were children. So our classes had a variation of students from my age. And I met somebody in New York much later, and we're talking to him, and I was in college, and I'm talking to him, and he said, well, he had to go home because he was going to put the kids to bed. And I said, Andre, are you married? He said, yes. And he was in my class in the 3rd grade, and he was that much older than I was at that point. But anyway, that's... at that point in time in Rosh Hashanah, and I have a photograph of that. That was a school for Jewish children that remained. Just imagine now there are 15,000 children that were in Holland at the time. But you can see the photograph in a few minutes. Shows you how few remained out of that. We're now all of those who attended the school. Were scattered all over the world, Canada, the United States. Many went to Palestine, at what was called Palestine at that time, now Israel, obviously. A lot of them ended up in Beverly Hills. Don't ask me how. But they did. The Hidden Children, there's a group that's worldwide, and there's a big chapter in Beverly Hills. And most of them are Dutch, and most of them were in school with me, so it's... that's the world. Could I have the next slide, please? When I left the children's home, this is where the adults were located before the transportation to concentration camp in Holland. The first part is when it was still new. The second part is where they bombed it. That happened later in the war because it was the headquarters for the SS in Holland. So they did finally get rid of it, but that's a little bit late. Next slide, please. Okay, this is what I mentioned earlier, the Schouwburg, and that's still there. That's now a Jewish museum. That photograph is taken inside, and that looks a lot better than the conditions were. You see the children, you see the ages, but there were teenagers there. It wasn't just us. Let's see, I can't even see anymore. You can see it from there. I can't see it from here. But you can see the narrow space between the buildings. On the left-hand side of the building is the Schouwburg, and on the right-hand side is the school through which we escaped. Next slide, please. Okay, these are the forged documents that I still owe. You see the red cross through it. That was done by the Dutch government after the war because my mother used that as her false ID card, and that's a photograph of my mother. Those printing plates were made by my father, so that's why we kept them, or I kept them. The ration cards is the upper left-hand corner. I think that's I can't see anything else on it, but you can tell me what's there. The next slide, please. Okay, this is Rosh Hashanah. Now, the red arrow points where I'm sitting, on top of the cab, if anybody is interested. But this is all that remains of the about 15,000 Jewish children in Holland. Like I said, we're no longer in Holland. I don't think any of them that were in that school remained in Holland. 90% of those were orphans. Let's think of that. I was lucky. I had a mother, but so many didn't. And I think, can I have the next slide, please? Sonia knows a little bit about this, but these are the stepping stones that they called. These are being inserted in the houses in Europe. In many cases, it started in Germany, by the way, and it started in Berlin, where they started putting these stones with the names and times when they left, were taken away, and where they died in which concentration camp. Now, this is obviously a Sephardic family, and it happened to be family on my mother's side. They obviously did not survive. And next is the last and final slide. Okay, that's the Dutch family that we stayed with in the latter part of the war. Now, of course, unfortunately, Pete, who was my age, he died last year. And those were his parents. And the other one is Pete again, with my youngest granddaughter, when we went to visit them in Holland. The surprising thing is, and that's sort of very interesting, the grandson of the Van Dorns and their great-granddaughter are going to visit us next week. And they're going to stay for 2 weeks, or 10 days actually. And hopefully they're going to stay in the V. We managed to get an apartment. And hopefully you'll get to meet them when they get here. But thank you. If any questions, you can do it afterwards, okay?
We are on a purple sunshot evening, under wide flowering chestnut trees, upon the threshold full of dust, yesterday, today, the days are all like these. Trees flower forth in beauty, lovely too their very wood, all gnarled and old, that I am half afraid to peer into their crown of green and gold. The sun has made a veil of gold, so lovely that my body aches. Above the heaven streak with blue, convinced I've smiled by some mistake. The world's abloom and seems to smile. I want to fly, but where? How high? If in barbed wire things can bloom, why couldn't I? I will not die.
I invite you to please rise. As we conclude our ceremony of remembrance inside the sanctuary, we will join together in singing Hatikvah. Following Hatikvah, I'll invite everyone to please join us by the Kriya sculpture in our courtyard. I'll invite you to do something which may be the most difficult thing we ask you to do. And that's to leave this place and enter our memorial space in silence. For those that wish, there are memorial candles. There we will partake in offering El Mali Rachamim and Kaddish. For now, we join together in this song of hope, the international anthem of the Jewish people. Kol